Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. I'm so glad to see and hear all of you here today. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your MC, cat herder, and host for the next hour. And I'll be taking you through the questions of where education and technology are going in the future. But to begin with, let me just introduce the forum so I can explain where it came from, how it works, and who supports it. And then we'll dive in with this week's guest. So to begin with, you should know the forum is a discussion-oriented platform. The forum is about conversation, and it spins off of the Future Trends of Technology and Education report. And that's a monthly publication that takes a look at major trends reshaping education and technology. We've been doing this for years with a database of about 86 trends. So you can take a look at ftte.us and learn more about our previous findings, or subscribe. It's a monthly report, PDF, pretty big, very rich, and very accessible. Now, the other thing this is related to, both FTTE and the forum are related to the Future of Education Observatory. Over the next slide, please, there. The observatory is an ongoing multimedia participatory exploration of where education is going and how it's changing. So that includes the Future Trends Forum right here today. That includes the FTTE report. It includes a blog, which has right now 600,000 words and more than 1,000 entries. It includes a book club, includes a bookstore, and more things still coming up. It's a unique effort to try to get some intelligence and foresight as to where education and technology are going. If you haven't seen it, go to futureofeducation.us and check it out. And next slide, please. Now, when we speak of the future of education and technology, we really want to make sure that we think about this in as global a way as possible. It's really too easy to get trapped in thinking about one's particular immediate geographic location, one's community, one's state, or one's nation or region. It's really important to realize that we are thinking about this in a global way. Here, Tara, over to the next slide, please. That we involve guests, participants, and ideas from all over the world. So we have participants from multiple continents. We have guests from just about everywhere, in fact. That's vital because the next great development in education technology might not come from your neighbors. It might come from Kazakhstan. It might come from South Africa. It could come from Peru. So as we proceed, think about things globally as well as locally. Over the next slide, please. Now, to try to proceed, we'd like to thank the people who helped make all of this possible. Here, Tara, let's go to the next slide, please. First, we want to thank NYSERNet in New York State. This is a group that helps get that state's colleges and universities on high-speed broadband all across the state. We're really grateful to them for their persistent and generous support. We're also really grateful to Shindig because, as you can see, they make available this technology we're using now. So let me just take you through it so you can see the different ways that it supports conversation. Where I am right now, and where the slide is, just for the next couple of seconds, this is called the stage. And everybody involved in this video conference can see and hear what's going on up here. This is where our guest will be. And you can join us if your mic and camera are working. In fact, up here, you can have 4 different pods, a kind of panel going on. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. Now, below us, you can see a whole row of icons, maybe 20 at a time. And some of them have a smiling face attached to them, like Michael Di Pietro. Some of them have a silhouette, like Anders Norberg. Each of those represents a single person or a sign-in. If you'd like to learn more about those people, one of the things you can do is you double-click on them. And if they'd like to talk to you, your 2 icons will click together like Legos. You can have your own private audio-visual bubble. Now, there are other ways to communicate. Look at the bottom of the screen. There's a white control strip running along it. And there are a few different buttons that I will draw your attention to. On the leftmost edge is a button that has what looks like a bunch of human heads and a little dialog box from a cartoon. If you click that, 2 windows pop up at the same time. One is a list of all the participants. So right now you can see about 56 different people. And every one of them is represented by an icon. You can mouse over them and get a little bit more information about each one of them. So it might be that you mouse over Nate Angel, who has Ed attached to his name, or Sean Ollinger, who's technology coordinator. And you can then click on them and learn still more information. It gives you a kind of quick overview of the entire population on this video conference. To the right side is a text chat, and that's for everybody here who can have conversations. So far we've been introducing ourselves. We have Anders Norberg from Northern Sweden. We We have Sean Ollinger from Loyola University in Illinois, Tom Haynes from Houston in Texas, and so on. So you can use that chat box. It's quick and easy. You can share comments. People often share resources or links. It's a great place to try out ideas and responses to questions. So the chat box is there for you. Now back to that white strip. To the right of it is a question mark in a circle. Now that is the ask button. If you click that, it will pop a little box where you can type in a comment or a question that you would like us to ask. So when the time is right, we'll flash it on the screen so everyone can read it, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Now, next to that on the white strip is a third method for communication. There's a raised hand. If you click that button, that'll tell us that you'd like to join us on stage. So if your microphone is working, if your camera is working, if you're in a place where you can talk out loud and hear just fine without getting in trouble, click that and you can join us on stage. It's really easy to do. You'll see that we can have up to 4 people here at once. That's another way to converse, in some ways the most powerful. So those are 3 different mechanisms. And on top of that, if that's not enough, head over to Twitter, use the hashtag FTTE, and you can send us comments and thoughts. And already we're starting to see people do that right now. So what I'm doing now, of talking to you and showing you slides, we're not going to do any more. The rest of the hour is all about you and about our guests and our conversations. And we're very grateful to Shindig for providing the technology that lets this all happen. We're also grateful to one other population. I want to thank them before we start. Over on Patreon, if you don't know Patreon, Patreon is a crowdfunding support site like GoFundMe or the Kickstarter. And it funds creative people making stuff. In that case, the creative person is me, making stuff about the future of education. So you can see right now we have plenty of people, everyone from Michael Haggins, Jeannie Kim Hahn, Paul McConaughey, Kyle Johnson, the unrelated Bob Johnson, Robin DeRosa, Corey Hess, Matthew P. Henry. All these people are contributing as little as $1 a month just to keep the lights on and keep everything going. We're really grateful to them. And if you haven't been there, go to patreon.com/BrianAlexander and you can learn more. All right, that's who supports us and for whom we're very grateful. That's how this whole forum works. Now, let's get to the action. Let's talk to our guest. Michael Horn is someone I've known for years and someone you may have read or heard from because he's very prominent in the field of how education is being transformed. He's currently the senior partner at Entangled Solutions. We're going to ask him about what that means and what that entails. He's written a great deal of high-profile books and articles about how education is being transformed. I'm really, really grateful he had the time to join us today, and I think you'll find he's a very, very exciting guest. So please, let's welcome Michael Horn. Let's bring him up on stage. And everybody, as he comes up on stage, get ready to ask him questions. Greetings, Michael.
Hey, how are you? Good to be with you, Brian.
Good. I'm so glad you could come. Where have we found you today?
I'm actually at home in Lexington, Massachusetts for the first time in a few weeks. So it's a good day.
Oh, no. Oh, I didn't realize that. I'm actually going to be shooting down your area this afternoon. I'm driving down to Worcester to do a workshop.
We could have done it live. Oh, well.
We could have done this in a car. Both of us, and talking as we go. Well, I'm so glad to see you here. Listen, before we jump into some of the topics, tell us, what do you do at Entangled Solutions? And for that matter, what does Entangled Solutions do?
Why don't we start with the latter? Entangled Solutions is part of a larger company called the Entangled Group. We're an education technology studio, and we basically have a simple thesis that the world has shifted from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy, or some might even say an automation economy. And our higher education ecosystem hasn't fully kept up. And so our goal is to help the higher education ecosystem innovate and transition to support that knowledge economy that we now have. And we do that in a variety of ways. Entangled Solutions, where you have that title for me, is a consultancy that works with higher ed institutions to help them innovate, whether that's strategy, new program creation, actually getting our hands dirty on innovation management of some sort. We use those insights to co-incubate with institutions, new companies, and nonprofits that we think can have a transformational effect toward that shift that we really need right now in the education ecosystem.
Well, that's a lot of work. That's very ambitious. So I can see why you're a studio rather than, say, purely a consulting firm or, say, a venture capital firm. Where is it based? Is this based in San Francisco or?
Yeah, Entangled is based in San Francisco. The reality is there's a bunch of people like me around the country, of course, but the vast majority of people are in San Francisco. And we wanted to not be a venture capital firm because, quite frankly, we think that a lot of the investments in education technology, while important, and there's some very important venture ones, a lot of them need much longer time horizons than venture capitalists are patient for to really produce enduring impact and change.
Got it. Well, that's an important difference. So let me ask then, as part of the Entangled Group and as part of Entangled Solutions, and as well as doing all of your work, what are you focusing on in 2018? What's taking up most of your time and thinking?
Yeah, so there's a few things taking up a lot of time. I'll say the biggest one in terms of institutions is helping them with this process of managing innovation. Obviously, higher ed institutions
Yeah.
are no stranger to the importance of innovation over the last few years, and they've taken various stabs at it. Our perspective increasingly from the clients we work with and the folks that we've talked to is just that they're getting so many pitches for innovations from faculty members, from alum, board of directors, foundations, et cetera, that actually there's so many things on their plate that creating a structured process to manage it so that they do it with intentionality toward the actual goals that they hold is really important right now. And so we're really helping them with that innovation management process itself, and in some cases acting as an outsourced shop to actually manage the first couple stages of those nascent innovations for them.
Well, that's an awful lot of work. That's an awful lot of work. And I think over the next few minutes, we're going to start pressing you what some of those innovations are. Friends, I have a whole battery of questions. I always over-prepare, and I have a stack of questions to ask. But what happens during these hours is you will have your own questions. You will have your own comments and your own thoughts. So again, please remember to use either that raised hand to join us on stage or the question mark to type in your question, or hit the chat box just to share your thoughts and ideas. I'll be monitoring Twitter in a way. So just if we just start off with this, what are some of the biggest and most interesting innovations that you're seeing in higher ed right now?
Yeah, good question, Brian. I think they range in a variety of ways right now. I think one of the biggest ones, obviously, we've been seeing and people are continuing to wrestle with is the interface between education and employers, and how do you align those things more and think about lifelong learning in a more robust, shall we say, or as the Northeastern President Joseph Aoun would say, robot-proof way.
Yes.
And so we've been thinking a lot around competency-based learning. How do you map competencies that employers need? And one of our hypotheses is, everyone criticizes higher ed institutions as being tone deaf to employers, but actually employers are unbelievably inarticulate about what they actually need in employees. They actually have no idea what differentiates one employee from another in terms of the knowledge and skills that they have. And so job postings and the like tend to be this just, we'll throw every single thing possible under the sun that we can think of that might be valuable with no sense of whether it's really correlated or even causal performance. And so helping institutions map competencies for the programs that they're seeking to contribute is something that I think is a very big part of innovation right now that needs more focus, but is something that I'm just starting to see bubble up right now that I'm excited about. I'll give you one more just to chew on, and then we can go a million different directions for sure, because there's a lot of things. But really interested in the rise of mobile learning solutions that are starting to pop up. My sense is that this is sort of the next wave of disruption in this space, if you will. If online learning, broadly speaking, was the first, mobile learning that really doesn't have video in many cases. And I actually kind of like the simple form factor that encourages very active learning, where you're really co-creating knowledge together by responding on an interface every 6 to 7 seconds. And you're seeing very low cost, much more accessible programs start to be launched through some of those platforms that I think will embed instructional design in a much better way than traditional online learning programs have. So those are two things that I'm interested and excited about right now in the landscape.
Well, let's press in on those, and let's see again what you'd be thinking of in response. So before mobile learning, the interface between employers and institutions. I'm curious. That's often where community colleges have taken the lead, where they're often very closely knitted to local employers and businesses. Do you find community colleges still ahead of this game, or are they in particular sectors or individual campuses outside of the CCs that are really doing well?
Yeah, good question. I think community colleges, obviously, to your point, they've been seen as that interface between employers and higher education. Our sense of it is that they're not keeping up with the demand and the pace of evolution of the programs that are occurring. So a big area that we're seeing of importance, for example, is platform-centric skills. The notion that do marketing today, it's not the marketing that you may have learned in business school 20 years ago, but it's all these digital marketing tools, things like HubSpot, being on top of your sales through Salesforce and things like that, and actually conversant in these platform-centric skills are incredibly important. I'll give you another one: video game design or virtual reality. Unity is the platform, right, that you have to understand and be able to navigate and keep up with that, just that speed of innovation and the demand of skills on those platforms is something that a lot of higher ed struggles, given its departmental nature, focus on research and so forth. These aren't things that people wouldn't like to tackle in computer science or marketing departments and things like that. It just, there hasn't been an ability to keep up with the demand. And so those are some of the areas where we're seeing opportunity to accelerate. One of the companies we've created is called PathStream, dedicated to doing that, working with the ecosystem of learning objects that Unity, Facebook, others have created, and put those into courseware that faculty can easily adopt at these institutions. But I'll say, really impressed with the continued work Northeastern, for example, continues to do through its through its co-op programs to try to stay synchronized with what employers actually need. And then the last piece of that is often what employers seem to need is not just the technical knowledge and skills, but all these soft skills that they're calling around simply being able to be familiar with what it means to be a paid employee and the demands that requires. And so that's not something that community colleges have historically been tasked to necessarily focus on. And we're seeing a big void right now still in that space, but excitement around co-op programs and the like to tackle this.
It's twice you've mentioned Northeastern. So the co-op programs and also their president, Joseph Woon's book, Robot Proof. If you missed that, friends, I tossed a link to the press book, link on that in the chat box so you can see more. Before I get to say more, we have a video question coming in from, from Nate Angel, I think. Let's see if we can bring him up. There's always this dramatic moment. I really want to do the Star Trek beaming sound. I think that'd be best. Let's see.
Greetings.
Nate. Hey!
Yes.
Greetings,
Hello,
Nate.
Brian and Michael. So I'm Nate Angel. I work on communications at Hypothesis, the nonprofit that stewards open annotation technologies and practices. And full disclosure, Entangled Solutions actually did some consulting work for Hypothesis a while back. Thank you for that. My question was on a different tack, though. I was curious, Michael, how you think about the boundaries of educational infrastructure in the sense of what educational infrastructure and technology should educational institutions be providing or owning versus what kinds of infrastructure might be better outsourced to commercial vendors?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think we're seeing a range of solutions right now in the marketplace around that. I think what we are learning, and maybe I'll describe it in terms of this, is that the online program manager function, which folks like 2U Academic Partnerships, Embinet, and so forth would come to a university and say, let us do all of your online, all of the support for the online programming. You don't worry about a thing. We'll do it under this 10-year contract with a 60% rev share and so forth. Now, full disclosure, I'm on the board of Noodle Partners. I also saw Michael DiPietro of Extension Engine is in here. But my sense is that there's providers like Extension Engine, Noodle Partners, even Coursera now coming in and saying, whoa, don't go for a 60% revenue share. We're going to work out an a la carte, a customized approach to your institutional needs that actually starts to build some capacity within the institution itself to take over large parts of these functions over time. And so, Extension Engine does unbelievable customization work to create cutting edge programs. I would say Noodle Partners is really dedicated to stripping out the cost from higher ed and saying, hey, there's good enough outsourced vendors in these, learning relationship management or learning management systems, or for your marketing platform or whatever it might be, that you can just very quickly choose the one that best fits your needs, pay the negotiated amount that makes sense for you, and dramatically lower price. So that's one thing we're seeing dramatically changes the price point. The second thing then, to your point about technology stack, I think in general, it's not a great idea for institutions to try to own their own proprietary institutional stack unless they have such scale themselves that they can, or budget that they can upgrade and keep up with it. That's sort of a rule of thumb answer. There are obvious exceptions, right? If Western Governors University wants to own an online assessment system that they start to market out to the broader higher ed ecosystem, they have 100,000 students or so. That's going to be a very different value proposition at that point. So too, of course, with a place like Harvard Business School with their HBX Live platform, that might be something they can really invest in. Whereas a lot of us would just be better off going with Zoom or something like that. And so I think it's hard to give just a one answer to this, but I think being thoughtful and serious about what it takes to do the costs of keeping up with the upgrades that you need and so forth is a sobering reality that most institutions ought to think about before they just say, oh, we'll do it ourselves. Unless they have enormous advantages of dollars or scale, I would be suspect on the technology stack these days.
What if they have an advantage of in-house technology skills? I'm thinking about technology universities, for example.
Yeah, so I mean, like Carnegie Mellon might be the one that pops to mind naturally on that, where they're actually, as part of their research and developing all sorts of cutting edge tools, some of which become proprietary, some of which are open sourced, right? And that might be a place where actually they're a great test bed for using their own technology that they're developing and keeping it out. I think the point is, though, what you're alluding to, Brian, which is making sure that it's somehow attached to some competency that's not just a competency in the here and now, but will be so over the longer run, such that you're keeping up with it. Because, look, even Southern New Hampshire University, Southern New Hampshire Online, nearly 100,000 students. I think the overall campus is 105, 110,000 students or something. They spun out Motivus as a learning relationship management system. And I don't think I'm saying anything out of school by saying that the word on the street, how about we say it that way, has been that it's struggled and it hasn't produced all the outcomes that people had hoped for. And that's a massively scaled organization thinking it could spin it out. All by way of saying is that just this work is hard. And when you create an educational offering and you start to work with educational institutions other than your own, there is a compact you're making of sorts that's not just now with the administrators you've negotiated with, but the faculty, students, and so forth that have some level of dependence. And being realistic to that, I think, is important.
Well, that's a terrific answer. And Nate, thank you for terrific questions.
Yeah, great question. I hope it's a satisfactory answer.
And by the way, Nate, we're going to have to get one of you up here to talk as a guest to talk about hypothesis at some point this year.
Yeah, happy to do that. You might really want my colleague, Jeremy Dean, though.
Whichever one. You guys are both brilliant. Thank you. And before I have more questions that come up from you. We have a question from Fred Bashirs, who asks, does Entangled Solutions see itself as an online project management provider? For example, an OPM provider may offer these services: curriculum development, online course design, call support center. Good question, Fred.
Yeah, no, good question. We don't see ourselves an OPM by any stretch of the imagination. We're not going to come in and do what an OPM does with a soup to nuts answer. What we would be really useful for is helping figure out what program you would want to launch before you went with an OPM, to help think through the strategy that you're really trying to drive toward. If you're trying to do something very custom, something like that, we would really help think through the where and how and what strategy you should undertake. But we're not going to be your OPM by any means at all. We think that's a well-served market and not one we'd get involved in.
answer. Thank you, Fred. Fred always has fantastic questions that plumb right to the deep. We have another question from an old friend of mine, from Valerie Bach from Chicago. And this is actually a comment about mobile learning. She says, I found that many employers envision mobile experiences for their employees that they will do on the bus or the train in their commute. But this doesn't work for drivers, and it can be disrespectful of personal time. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And my sense is less that it should be mobile learning on the convenience of what the employer thinks it's convenient, but more framed in terms of what the user, him or herself, is trying to accomplish. And the great thing about most of these mobile learning solutions we're seeing is that they're emerging in flexible ways. So that can be on your time on the mobile phone, but it can also be on your laptop computer if that is for some reason a more convenient thing. What I'm particularly excited about is that I'm seeing a tremendous amount of interest in emerging markets, in developing countries, in Africa and so forth, to create higher ed offerings that start to upskill the citizens of those countries. And in a lot of those places, the bandwidth and technical infrastructure that we take for granted in the United States is just not available in the same way. And a mobile learning solution that does not use video, does not hog a lot of bandwidth, is just a way more suitable offering. And so I think it can greatly extend access. I think the big mistake is to think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution in any of this that's going to serve all needs at all times. I think that's just a mistake. And what we're seeing is the opposite. It's more and more mass customization to be able to fit around the needs of the individual, as opposed to what the institution thinks is the way to do it. And so, that's going to take a variety of forms. The other pushback would be, well, some people think synchronous learning is always the best way to learn, and that doesn't respect people who might have obligations, work, family, otherwise, during the time that a class meets. And the point is, hey, for those students for whom that makes sense, that synchronous learning experience could be outstanding, right? And for some people, it's not going to make a lot of sense. And so having the flexibility, I think, is an important thing, or just to be able to be honest and say, hey, if this doesn't describe you or your situation, this program design is going to be a better fit than this one. And just being truth in advertising and being honest about those things up front.
That makes sense. Kind of larger trend of increasing customization and flexibility. Friends, as you can see, it's easy to ask questions. So please bubble them up, or else you'll be forced to suffer me asking more and more questions, and nobody wants that. We have one I wanted to come back to on the question of innovations. Where are you seeing most of the impetus for innovations? Is this happening because it has to, say, boards from private institutions, or state governments for public institutions, or is it coming from the upper leadership of a campus administration, or is it coming from faculty? What's the source?
Yeah, that's a good question. My take is a couple-fold on that answer. So point one, I think there is significant pressure from boards, states, and so forth on their institutions to innovate, and they're looking to see that right now. And so presidents are on the receiving end of that pressure, even if it's not a very targeted pressure, right, with a sense of what they're trying to drive toward or why. Part of that is the macro environment of, Brian, you and I have been on the same campus a few times, or either synchronized or separated by a few days, of campuses that were having significant fiscal challenges and see the need to innovate out of that in some way. And so I think that's part of it. Part of it is the enrollment cliff and decline that we see coming in traditional age students, and the needs to serve a very different and more diverse population of students, both age, in terms of racial makeup, income, and so forth, than we've ever seen before in this country. And so I think some of that is providing the pressure. I think the fiscal pressures also are on states that are continuing to retreat from financing higher education in some cases as well, and yet also trying to give constituents somehow a good deal. And so you're seeing this pressure there as well. The second part of it, I think, is you don't see, though, institutions really innovate unless a leader has made it a priority for the institution. And so by that, I mean president or provost really saying this is something that we are doing as an institution and committing to. And against that, you're seeing the rise of this chief innovation officer position, which 10 years ago, I think barely existed, is becoming a bit of a trend. And Jeff Salingo, who works, a colleague of mine at Entangled, wrote a piece a couple months ago on the rise of the chief innovation officer at institutions and the different ways institutions are creating these offices, sort of three different models he profiles in the piece. My take is that is representing an institutional commitment from the leadership level to innovation, and secondarily, it's showing you how far that commitment extends. Are we looking for something transformational that's going to change the face of the institution, or are we looking for something that's going to work within our current faculty, departments, et cetera, and try to move the ball forward, but within the current bounds of the institution? The third thing I think you're seeing, though, in terms of your faculty question, is faculty certainly have some great ideas for innovating. I mean, the irony of the conversation around higher ed is faculty in some ways are born innovators because they're constantly doing research at the forefront of not just science, technology, and so forth, but also humanities, how we should think about ourselves and the like. And so they're sort of natural innovators in some ways, and there are lots of great ideas from below. I think what we've seen is that unless the institutional leadership has a way to harness those ideas and move them through what can be a very cumbersome or complicated faculty senate process, that those don't have liftoff. And so one of the hopes of the innovation management that we've been trying to work with institutions on and wrote a paper on as well through Entangled is just to help people think through how do you create a transparent process that makes the rules of the game, so to speak, for advancing innovation very clear, very transparent, so faculty know how to participate in it and aren't surprised by when things start to get funded and start to move forward in any way, and understand from where it's coming and why.
Do you find that when a campus institutes a chief innovation officer, that tends to come with processes that make it easier to identify faculty initiatives like that?
Yeah, absolutely, especially when they set them up. So there's sort of three different ways, as I mentioned, to set them up. One is sort of the autonomous skunkworks model, right, which is kind of outside of the faculty and is a little bit more of a top-down model. If we're going to launch something truly disruptive and do something that we've never done before, great for launching breakthrough innovations, but perhaps not as good as harnessing the internal faculty motivations to innovate as well. And the second one would be, and as I'm saying this, I'm blanking on the third. But the second one we're seeing is much more of an internal consultancy to help surface those innovation ideas from faculty and figure out how to steward them into something that can actually help the institution innovate and actually see the light of day to have impact.
We have a quick comment from Vanessa Vale on this. And by the way, if you're on Twitter, Vanessa just shared a fantastic link collection from Michael's work. So just go to FTTE or look for her handle, which is VC Vale, V-A-I-L-E. She observes that smaller rural schools are often strapped for cash and often tech expertise. They probably need an innovation officer, but they can't afford one. That's not a question, that's a comment or observation.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely accurate point, right? I think I'll comment from someone who lives in the Northeast. And if you're outside of an urban environment, and heck, even if you're inside an urban environment, particularly these small institutions right now, huge need for a chief innovation officer, and yet the budgetary situation is just very limited toward that. And quite frankly, just the notion of we're going to launch another Me Too online program is not going to bring in the revenue or students that some of these places may think that they should or would have even 10 years ago. And so the need to have someone strategic really thinking about those market opportunities, I absolutely agree, is critical, and yet underfinanced. It points to something sort of brutal, which I'm going to step out of higher ed for a moment, which is just talking about the Innovators Dilemma more generally, that Clay Christensen, my mentor, former colleague, has written about quite a bit. Collaborator is a better way to say it. Yeah. I'll say mentor, though. I've learned mostly from him. So yeah, but the time to innovate is when things are flush, and yet that's the time when you feel the least need to innovate. And then when times are really rocky, that's often when it's hardest to innovate. Now, the exception to that rule, I think, would be a place like a Southern New Hampshire University or a Paul Quinn College or a Bellevue University in Nebraska. These are places that basically hit rock bottom each at different times and innovated their way out of it. So in the case of Bellevue University in the 1980s, they did declare bankruptcy and reinvented themselves as a school for adult learners explicitly, and have developed a very robust online learning presence that's highly ranked in U.S. News and World Report. You look at Southern New Hampshire Online. Paul LeBlanc saw it the same way in the early 2000s. The campus was cratering, and he saw online as a way to change the fortunes, and it dramatically has. And then Paul Quinn College, a historically black college in Dallas, Texas, that I think had a 1% graduation rate when the current president, Michael Sorrell, assumed the helm, or just before. And they've created this sort of work-study notion of being paid for work that gets you an academic transcript and a work transcript when you graduate. That seems to be dramatically changing the fortunes of that campus. I think he told Jeff Salingo and I have a podcast, Future You, and he told us on the podcast that'll be coming out, I think, in a couple weeks, that the graduation rate, I think, is now 31%. So it's 30 percentage point increase in just 5-6 years, right? Which is quite a turnaround.
Well, it sounds like, among other things, that not only are you helping make some of these innovations happen, but you're also a good clearinghouse for information about them. Good. We have a question from Roxanne, and I will ask it even though Roxanne has not showed us a recent photo of her dog. Roxanne's question is very good. When a solution is adopted by your client, how is the success evaluated over time? What tools do you use to measure success? Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I would say all too often consulting firms just think about the time billed and not the actual outcomes themselves. So totally agree with it. So I'll focus on Entangled Solutions explicitly, because the answer would differ for some of our portfolio companies in certain cases. But for Entangled Solutions as an innovation consultancy, we try to be very clear with the client up front around what are the goals and what does success look like, not just at the end of this engagement, but after we leave for whatever we launch together, what does success for that look like? And then to stay abreast on that and track it. And I would say we're not always successful at doing that. It's something we're trying to be better and better at. But another place, for example, that we are thinking about this is mergers and acquisitions. So we think that there's going to be a large number of institutions. I didn't mention this earlier, Brian, but we think that there's going to be a large number of institutions that either close their doors, or we hope more likely merge or are acquired over the next 10, 15 years. And I say hope just because I think that'd be a better outcome than outright closure, with all the dissatisfaction that creates for faculty and students. And so we think that there's an enormous opportunity for innovators among the group that are maybe in a healthier position, not to view this as sort of a damsel in distress, I'm going to save you moment, but a much more proactive strategy of how do we better serve larger numbers of students over larger geographies than maybe we've contemplated in the past. And in those cases, for those merger and acquisition contracts, we're actually tying significant portion of the percentage of our fee to success for the client, and defined at various stage gates, whether that's actually finding an institution, successfully acquiring, successfully then integrating with them. And so actually tying our fees to the success of the client so that they're not just paying us, say, a monthly retainer for something that they don't get out of anything on the other side, is increasingly become something that we're quite serious about.
Oh, that's a fascinating move. That's quite a business plan. Good for you. And
trying.
And naturally, thank you, Roxanne. Roxanne always has fantastic questions. Speaking of fantastic forum, friends, we have Tom Hames. Let's see if we can beam him up on stage. From Houston, which has had spring since February, apparently. Hello, Tom. You're muted.
It was in the 50s last night. That's like subarctic, isn't it?
The suffering is real.
We're sitting here at like 35 degrees in the morning, so go ahead.
Yeah. So I have hopefully a short question, but may stimulate a longer answer. I'm wondering to what extent institutions are aware of the structural and cultural changes that these challenges represent to them. And when you come into a situation, how often is it that you have to sell them on that concept, or they've already sort of wrapped their heads around it to a certain degree, or you have a constituency? I mean, is it usually a precondition to your hiring for them or some group to actually understand what's wrong, or is there just a sense of something's wrong, help us? So
Great question. The answer is we see both, right? But let me just opine on one, which is that it's a lot easier to work with an institution if they've thought through seriously the level of cultural change and buy-in that they need to do whatever they need to do. And we will work with an institution through a change management process, undoubtedly, to help get buy-in. We do it actually fairly frequently. Some very interesting projects at the moment on that front. But I will say that if there's some significant resistance of major constituencies and just haven't given the forethought to what that's going to require, and then have brought us in thinking that we're a white knight that somehow magically transforms that without going through that, what can quite frankly be a painful process with them, faculty hearings, conversations, so forth, in a contract that reflects those expectations. Just you get out of whack, and it's not fun for us, and it's not fun for the institution, and it's something that we don't like to do. And quite frankly, we'll occasionally fire a client because we just think that they're wasting their money on something that is not going to produce the outcomes that they want. And it's I actually think that's an important statement of values for us, that we want to be advancing the ball. And if they want us coming in there helping them step by step bring faculty along, that's fine. That's a project we can do, but let's make sure we scope around that. And if it's not, then it's just a big misalignment. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, because it's a little bit of both. We definitely see, but you just want to be very transparent and clear about that up front, has been our experience. Otherwise, that misalignment on both sides is just it's both not fun, and it can be a waste of money on the downside.
no, I absolutely agree. Do you have a way of assessing this going in terms of sort of getting a feel for where that institution is mentally? Because I mean, that's a constant challenge for me in trying to bring together folks on both sides a lot of times of the equation who don't really have a clear understanding of where these shifts, the depth of these shifts, and how they're occurring.
Yeah, I would say it's something we're getting better at, but are still learning, to be totally candid. We're a 3.5-year-old firm, I think. So something we're learning a lot about, getting better at the pattern recognition, getting better at the conversations up front, quite frankly, to figure out where those questions lie and lurk. And quite frankly, ask better questions up front as well, to make sure that they've thought through it. And those key questions can be somewhat simple, right? Is the faculty bought in? Will the faculty senate need to talk about this? Is this something you've even talked to them about? Are the departmental chairs aware of it? Things like that. And if that's not been well understood, then we'll oftentimes step back and say, okay, we actually think we're talking about a longer engagement that has two different parts to it. The first part is going to be all about buy-in and really scoping the why and how before we get to the what. If we forget about the why and the how, then sort of the what is meaningless, because it's never going to achieve. It's never going to get in place.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good luck surviving some market temperatures. I know the suffering. We sympathize. We have a whole stack.
Air conditioning is horrible.
We have a whole stack of questions that have been flowing in, and I just want to get them before we run out of time. Because friends, we have 15 minutes left, so please make sure that you get a chance to share your thoughts and your questions, especially because Michael's been so gracious in answering them so carefully. We have one from Linda, who asks, we speak about student and employer buy-in. How can we move the needle in governmental regulations of higher education innovation? Staying with the Carnegie credit hour definition is not sustainable.
Thumbs up, totally agree. This has probably been, I'm going to step off the Entangled thing for a second and just say, from the Christensen Institute on forward, This has probably been the biggest thing that I've been writing about around competency-based learning and getting away from the credit hour as a flawed measure of time. Time spent learning is the wrong end of the student. We ought to be looking at actual progress in learning and so forth. And so I totally agree. It's a huge barrier to innovation. The federal government just can't wrap its head around even the 7 or 8 or whatever experimental sites, plus Western Governors University that's able to receive dollars from a Title IV perspective for getting beyond the credit hour, still in some ways maps back to the credit hour for the actual funding. And obviously we've seen the Inspector General put a very harsh report out on Western Governors to chill the innovation there in large respects that I think the department will ignore, but it's a huge issue. My take on this is that what we need to be advocating for is that the Department of Education create a very different type of experimental site program, and it might be through a new accreditor. I don't know that answer, but whereby you would say to institutions basically in return for being totally waived from all of the input-based requirements around the following areas, including credit hours, you as an institution say that you will come into some significant percentage of your income being in a shared risk way with the government, such that if students don't find meaningful jobs on the other end, that you're on the hook for some percentage of that earnings. So that we don't get charlatans in there taking advantage of abolishing the credit hour. But by the same token, we can start to figure out in a meaningful way what are the right incentives to actually unlock and unleash the power of competency-based learning to get beyond the credit hour. And so I just think if you said we're going to free up all the input-based stuff and all the compliance-based stuff that you have to report out on, that you have huge offices around doing, we're going to free you up around the majority of those things. And instead, we just want to see, do students go through your programs meaningfully, get gainful employment on the other end, which will signify because you'll be willing to share in the risk of financing those students in some meaningful way. And so I'd like to see more experimentation around that and maybe some more income-based repayment plans in that as well. But basically trade the outcomes even more stringent than any other program is in return for total freedom on the innovation side.
Linda, that's a fantastic question. You really hit a key theme. And Michael, thank you for that very passionate response. We have another question from Kisa. Kisa Johnson from Michigan, who asks, how are biases challenged when creating innovation within higher education? And Sean, we'll get to your question next, but that's Kisa's question first.
Yeah, so how are biases, sorry, say it one more time, Brian.
How are biases challenged when creating innovations within higher education?
Yeah, so there's probably a lot of different ways to think about the word bias in there. I think, I would love to know what types of biases they're thinking of when they ask that question, but I'll start to riff, and if they answer it, you can maybe jump in and give me a little bit more direction. But my sense is that one of the biggest ones is that we have a lot of false dichotomies that pop up in the education debates over the years. And so one of them is liberal arts education versus vocational education, that these are somehow totally opposite ends of the spectrum. When my sense is that to be a really good employee, actually having a liberal arts background or the ability to think critically and ask questions across a range of topics, not just within your specialty discipline, is actually really, really important and valued. At the same time, having domain knowledge in a particular technical skill is also important to be able to think critically within that domain. And so this is one of the classic things that I think you often will hear faculty or some corners of higher ed say, we don't want to just be an employer, focused shop of some sort, or voc ed or continuing technical education, career technical education. And then when they dig into it, they actually say, holy cow, that bias was wrong. These things are actually false dichotomies, and they're much more consistent than we ever thought about. The flip side, I think, is also true, which is that often you'll see a bias against the liberal arts from outside of the academy. And once you dig into it, you start to see actually these are incredibly important skills that have served many, many of us well, not just in terms of living a more enriched life, but also in the way we engage in the workplace. And so I think that's one of the biases that quickly falls apart. I'll say a second one, which is I think there's often an attitude outside of higher ed that faculty are just resistant and are the roadblock to innovation and on and on and on. And my sense is that in general, people don't act a certain way because they're opposed to something, but that they're within a structure that doesn't incentivize it. And so when you move faculty into an innovation unit or into an arm that is focused on a different goal in a different way, a different why, whatever it might be, they become your most passionate innovators and able to execute in really cool, novel ways. And so that blows apart, I think, a lot of the biases people have around the faculty members. And I already made the claim that I think faculty members are naturally actually very innovative people in many cases. From my perspective, it's often the right structure is the problem that's hindering them, not the faculty somehow unique mindset.
Okay, so I hope that's the answering the question in the direction that you're looking for. It's a great question, and Michael, that's another terrific answer that goes against some of the grain of the received narrative. In case if you want to say more in the chat box, please go ahead. I trumped over Shell's earlier question, so I want to bring that back, which is about accreditation. And we were talking about government before, and Shell asks, how do you see re-accreditation agencies either helping or hindering your efforts?
Yeah, good question. I have an entire chapter actually coming out in a new book by Susan Phillips and one of her colleagues, published by Johns Hopkins, I believe, in June, around the role of accreditation in innovation. And the results of our work in that chapter are not entirely encouraging because it feels at the end like it's a bit random. If you're in the know and you sort of have the political capital to innovate, then accrediting agencies are much more willing to give you rope and allow you to try some things that they might not otherwise. And if you're not on that side of it and you don't have those relationships and so forth, it can feel a bit random and interpretations of rules can go against you and actually severely limit you. And so it's not clear why in one place it's allowed and in another place it's not. This is me stepping out on a limb. If I were to redo the world, and I admit it's not going to happen like this tomorrow, but for a variety of reasons, it's not a practical reform step. But I think accreditation bodies play unbelievably important roles in self-improvement of an institution. I just think it's a really big mistake to then also have made them the gatekeeper to federal financial aid, because they're built around helping you improve. I don't know why that should be a gatekeeper function. It's asking them to do something for which they were not created. And I think you see this friction as a result of that very clearly. And I just think in general, separating judge, jury, executioner, improvement, et cetera, in life is a good principle and one that ought to be applied here somewhere as well.
Separation of powers.
Yes.
Yeah. Vanessa says, more pithily, accreditations agencies as they exist now are rather like setting the fox to guard the hen house.
Fox to guard the hen house, but also filled with a lot of hens. So it's kind of, I mean, it's funny, right? Because they're membership organizations. So it also has a club-like mentality that's, as long as you innovate within the club and like us, we're really excited about you. But the moment you start pushing the bounds outside of the club, unless you have that political capital like a Paul LeBlanc does in Southern New Hampshire, woe be you.
You mentioned relationships, and that's an example. Friends, we have time for one last question, and Fred Bashirs is going to climb up on stage. Let's see if his bandwidth holds so he can share his thoughts with us. And that may be an if. So this is the forum. We are far enough into the future that we sometimes outpace the reality of infrastructure. Well, Fred does have a text question. Maybe it's the same one. Speaking of mergers and acquisitions, it seems there's a trade-off between autonomy and sustainability. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I assume meaning institutional autonomy, because I think programmatic autonomy remains important to drive innovation. It's a takeaway from our research on disruptive innovation is that autonomy from traditional processes and priorities is absolutely critical for innovation. I think that's right in terms of a trade-off between autonomy and sustainability, though. And the reality is sustainability, by and large, wins that because if you have institutional autonomy but aren't going to survive, it sort of doesn't matter. And so I think we are going to see that. I think that there could be some very creative arrangements, though, that we haven't explored yet. And I'll pitch one here that I've been thinking about a little bit on the side. But many of you, I'm sure, know the Minerva Institute, which prides itself as the first elite liberal arts higher education university to launch in the last century, I think. And a key part of the program, there's a lot of interesting things, but part of it is that you spend a year in 4 different countries as part of your experience. So your first year in San Francisco, Buenos Aires, Germany, I think, and China maybe, or Korea or something. So what if you banded together 4 small liberal arts colleges in the United States, a couple of whom or places that, quote unquote, are no longer as desirable because they're not near urban centers where apparently all the jobs are. And you allowed people, though, to go for a semester rotation or a year rotation. I suspect a lot of people would love to go to the Appalachian region of North Carolina, for example, for a semester. They're a political science major to dig into what's the driving disaffection there. And you don't have to spend all 4 years there. You can still have your college experience at something, Whittier College in Los Angeles, something like that. But why not some intentional, even if it's not merger and acquisition, deep partnership activity that really creates new programs that allow you to be still unique to your region and mission, but maybe with a much more circumscribed time period rotating students through. I think you could create some very cool experiences in that way that might, it still, I think, Fred, would lose the trade-off on autonomy that you were talking about. But it wouldn't just be sort of Wheelock College is now part of Boston University. I don't think it would be just sort of that, transactional, if you will, which may be unfair to them. But I think you could be more thoughtful about creating novel experiences that higher ed has not seen an abundance of in the past and really innovate around it.
I wonder if the Council of Independent Colleges upper level humanities seminars program is a way towards that, where these small colleges let students take upper level humanities seminars at each other's campuses.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example, Ryan. I think it's something that the folks there have been thoughtful about, right? Both sharing best practices among each other, but also creating those sharing opportunities.
Well, speaking of interesting places, you're describing the Appalachian region. And Kisa mentioned that Appalachia State has a really good information or media literacy program. I have one last question for you, myself, and this is looking ahead a bit. Famously, Clayton Christensen and others have predicted the demise of certain small colleges and universities. Do you think that mergers and acquisitions are really the way forward? Thinking about Wheelock, thinking about Mount Ida, and if so, is that going to be large state institutions being the white knights? Is it going to be large, private, wealthy institutions? Or is it going to be third parties from outside the U.S., like, say, Chinese companies?
Yeah, great question. So Clay drives me nuts on this because every couple of years, he and I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2013 where I think we said 25% of institutions would close, merge, or go bankrupt. So it's a much bigger tent with a smaller number. And then every year or two, he says 50% dead in 9 years or something like that. And it lacks the subtlety and it's a much bigger number. I think the number, it may be closer to 15% in 15 years. But I think it's still that ballpark. And I think merger and acquisition is going to be a disproportionate share of that. I think bankruptcy will be part of it. I think closure will be part of it. But I think merger and acquisition will be a disproportionate part of it. As you think about who will be the bigger pieces of that, I think some of them will be combinations of small colleges getting together. I think there is also the emergence of a buyer class, if you will, in higher education. So these Southern New Hampshire's, Western Governors, Arizona states of the world, This rise of the mega university, I think, ought to acquire many of these to give themselves geographic presence in new markets to serve students and employers in unique ways. And I think that foreign idea, that's a possibility. My guess is, from an accreditation perspective, that would take us some while to get comfortable with. So I suspect that'll be a smaller piece of it.
But if the accreditation works, especially by relationships, those relationships can really advance it more quickly.
Absolutely.
A buyer class of institutions. Man, what a vision. I hate to pull the plug or pause this right now, but we have just shot past the end of the hour. So, Michael, thank you so much for introducing us to your work and to your thought. This has been terrific. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Brian, my pleasure, and thanks for hosting not just this forum, but all the work you do on the future of education. Really, really appreciate it, and it's been fun to be on, and I hope there's future opportunities.
Oh, I'm sure there will be. Thank you so much, and stay warm. Friends, I need to tell you about the next week and what we're up to. And as we do that, let me just thank everybody for fantastic questions. My gosh, it's just a real pleasure to learn from all of you here. Speaking of learning from everybody, next week, so that's going to be a week from Thursday, so that's May 3rd, our usual Thursday time, we're going to have Dawal Shah, who's one of the world's experts on MOOCs. So what's been happening with MOOCs? Where are they going internationally? Are they doomed? Have they crashed? Or are they growing? If so, where? So Dawal has been running a website that tracks these things, and he's a fantastic expert. So please bring your MOOC questions, your MOOC skepticism, your MOOC animated GIFs if you like. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And speaking of conversations, our book club has just started our reading of Cory Doctorow's Walkaway. So we're reading the first 3 chapters right now. If you haven't had a chance to grab it, this is a near-future science fiction novel about how society grapples with the end of scarcity. Fantastic characters, very, very funny, a really bold imagination, a book that actually I think really dares to be utopian in a dystopian age. I strongly recommend that. So please join us online to read along with that. And of course, you can grab a copy at our Future Education bookstore, the only one in the world, where you can find other titles from forum guests, including from Michael Horn. And in the meantime, if you want to keep the conversation going on top of that, you can always do this through Twitter. You can find me at Brian Alexander. You can find Shindig, and you can use the hashtag FTTE. Again, thank you all for a terrific conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next one. Until then, see you later. Bye-bye.